This is going to be a short video explaining how to approach the 2.3 exercises in the 2.3 Aplia assignment set on MindTap for the Philosophy 120 course. Alright, so for each of these sections within the assignment, you're going to be asked to look at a passage and then determine whether a fallacy is committed, and then finally determine whether a particular fallacy is committed. So for each of these, for instance this one, an experienced structural engineer told me that termite damage to a load-bearing beam pose a risk of the roof collapsing over my garage. I should therefore replace the beam. Okay, so for each of these, my strategy should first off be to figure out what the argument is, which requires figuring out what the conclusion is and then seeing what the support for it is, and then identifying if there's an error in the reasoning, and then if a particular kind of error is committed. In this case, we're looking for appeals to unqualified authorities. So these will be cases where someone has given advice about what to do, but they're not really a legitimate source for that advice or that policy. Okay, so here I have an experienced structural engineer telling me that this termite thing is going to likely cause my roof to collapse, or could cause my roof to collapse, excuse me, and then the conclusion is that I should replace the beam. Alright, so my conclusion is that I should replace it, and my support for that is that this experienced person told me. When I'm looking at this then, although it seems like it might be on the right track for an appeal to unqualified authority because it is relying on an authority, this is someone I should take seriously, an experienced structural engineer. They should know about what is likely to cause risk of roof collapse, in this case, the termite damage. So at the passage to the left, I'm going to say this does not commit a particular fallacy in that case, because it seems like a fine reason then to replace that beam given this advice I've gotten from a structural engineer, right? So people who would be qualified to tell me about the risk of roof collapse would be maybe something like a pest control guy who's had experience with termites, but certainly this structural engineer should have some experience with this kind of thing and give me good advice. So it does not then commit a particular appeal to unqualified authority fallacy. Right? If it doesn't commit a fallacy, it's not committing the particular one, so don't ever make that kind of mistake. And then I would do that for each of the other ones. Let's see if I can find one that actually has it. And sometimes these will be randomized, so what I'm showing you here, don't expect to see the exact same thing when you do the assignment. Alright. Let's go to the last one. Chelsea is a fantastic guitar player. A cello is a stringed instrument just as a guitar is a stringed instrument, so Chelsea is probably a fantastic cello player too. Okay, so there's clearly a kind of error in reasoning in this one, that just because Chelsea is fantastic at this thing doesn't necessarily mean she's fantastic at this other stringed instrument. So it does commit some kind of error in the reasoning. The conclusion is that Chelsea is probably a fantastic cello player, but this doesn't really directly get me there. But is this an appeal to an unqualified authority? No, it's not. We're not using the advice of Chelsea to generate some conclusion about what we ought to do. We're instead erroneously attributing an attribute of the cello to all, or excuse me, an attribute of guitars to all stringed instruments. It's a bit like perhaps then a composition fallacy, maybe also a hasty generalization about guitar player then liking all stringed instruments or something. So it does not commit that particular fallacy. And that's how I would do all of these. You click rate it now at the end, that gives you your attempt, and then if you haven't gotten the score that you like, you can go back and take it 2 more times, potentially with some of the same ones showing up again and having some feedback. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the assignment now. Are you sure you want to continue without saving? Yes, I do. Real quickly now, I'm going to blow through an example of each of the following and not spend too much time doing multiple sets. So this is an appeal to ignorance fallacy. I'm looking for a case where someone is saying that because there's lack of proof, that somehow proves that something is lacking. So every time I'm awakened by the alarm at the fire station down the street, I learn that a fire is broken out nearby. If we want to reduce the risk of fire in our neighborhood, we should prohibit the fire station from sounding its alarm. That's clearly a kind of error in reasoning. It's probably not the alarm that's causing the fires. But this is not an appeal to ignorance fallacy because it's not talking about lack of evidence or lack of proof. This is a more obvious example, I suspect. No one has ever been able to give unequivocal proof for the existence of God, therefore we must assume that God does not exist. So this is the error. Yes, it does commit a fallacy, and this is a hallmark appeal to ignorance case because you're claiming that because there's no proof for something, that somehow shows that that thing doesn't exist, that we shouldn't believe it, something along those lines. Alright. Let's go back. Hasty generalization. Okay. The mechanic who works on my car has a PhD in astrophysics. I didn't realize people had to get a PhD in order to become a licensed auto mechanic. Okay. this is an error in reasoning, that just because they happen to have a PhD in astrophysics, it doesn't mean that they all have to. So this could potentially be a hasty generalization, right? You're thinking that this one person, the mechanic who works in the car, has a PhD, is somehow indicative of every single member of the group, that all mechanics will have a PhD in astrophysics. Or I guess I didn't realize people had to have a PhD. Okay, so this one could be. Let's say that's a hasty generalization. You are applying a limited experience that this one person has a PhD and then saying, well, I guess everybody has got one to become a licensed auto mechanic. Would take that. The vast majority of logic professors at U.S. colleges have earned advanced degrees in philosophy. When you take logic next semester, your professor will probably have an advanced degree in philosophy. Okay, this one looks like it could be on the path. Again, we're talking about going from some set of individuals and then talking about another individual in that set, which tends to happen in generalization reasoning. But this one is actually not an error in reasoning, because this looks like good evidence for the conclusion that when you take your logic class next semester, your professor will probably have an advanced degree in philosophy. What's crucial here is that they say probably rather than you definitely will, and that earlier we've given pretty good evidence for that. The vast majority of logic professors in the U.S. Have earned advanced degrees in philosophy. Now we have to assume when you take your logic class next semester that you're also taking in the U.S., but assuming you are, this would not then be a hasty generalization fallacy, because there's enough cases to make that claim. All right. False cause. These are going to be cases where there's an assumed causal relationship between things when it's likely to not be the case, given other evidence or given some basic reasoning about the scenario. So we don't know that someone will not invent a time travel train at some point in the future, so we must assume that time travel is possible. Okay, this is closer to appeal to ignorance. So it does commit a fallacy, but does not commit the false cause fallacy, because it's saying something about lack of evidence and then making an assumption about what could be the case. So we can't prove that someone will not invent a time machine at some point in the future. Is another way to read this. So we must assume that it will be possible. Not so much. Let's see about this one. The pilot who safely landed a commercial airliner in the Hudson River has been called a hero, blah, blah, blah. But there are hundreds of other pilots in northern Alaska and the other areas, blah, blah, blah. Why don't they get invited? Okay, nothing. Here, we've got a case where we got to figure out what is the eventual conclusion. Something about others not getting invited to attend the president of the city or the president's State of the Union address, and so they're assuming the cause of this pilot blah 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 landing in the river is that perhaps there's an error here, but there are hundreds of other pilots in northern Alaska, Canada, and other remote areas who deliver supplies via seaplane and often land safely on water. All right, why don't they get invited to attend this? They're saying that there are others who have done something similar, and so they should be invited as well. This is less a false cause and more of like a weak analogy, that there's distinctions between those folks in northern Alaska landing on the water and this person who landed on the Hudson River with this giant plane. So not necessarily false cause, more like false analogy. When I have worn my lucky cufflinks while I'm playing the slot machines in Vegas, I have won more often than I have lost. I am certain that those cufflinks have special power over the slot machines in Vegas. Okay, this is sort of a hallmark case. This is an error because it's assuming that your cufflinks are the cause of this thing, when there are actually probably better explanations that this just happens to be coincidence or luck that those cufflinks are resulting, or that you wear the cufflinks and then you win. That's not the cause of you winning. It's something else entirely, really. It's a game of chance. So it does commit an error, and that error is the false cause fallacy. Let's look at slippery slope. All right. So remember, for slippery slope fallacy, you're going to be looking for cases where someone is setting up this inevitable causal chain reaction, or chain reaction that occurs when you allow one thing, then eventually we get to this other thing. But generally it's the case if the slope is not so slippery, you could stop, you could avoid this inevitable chain reaction. Let's go right down here to 3. My father has promised to buy me a new car if I get an A in this class. But to get an A in the class, I need to get at least a B on the final exam. I know it will be impossible for me to get a B on the final exam tomorrow if I go to that party tonight. So if I want that car, I had better skip tonight's party. Okay, so here we do have a chain of causes. Wanting to get this thing, namely getting the car, and my argument if I'm this person is that the only way to get that car is if I skip tonight's party, or I had better skip tonight's party. All right. So when you're looking at this, that one is sort of baiting the hook, because it seems like, oh yeah, this is on the right track here. My father has promised to buy me a new car if I get an A. We don't know if that's the only way that he's going to do it, but reading it, it seems like it could be that this is what he says. If I get an A, then I will get the car. I could potentially get the car without that, but let's assume that he means it in the only if case. And then we go through the reasoning. To get an A, I need to get at least a B on the final. That's something that also seems like that's got to be the case. This isn't a false causal setup. That needs to be, having looked at my grades. And I know it will be impossible for me to get B on the final exam tomorrow if I go to that party tonight. All right. That one is perhaps less obvious, but it seems reasonable to assume that if you go to the party, you're less likely to get that B. And they conclude, so if I want the car, I had better skip tonight's party. That's the way to avoid having these consequences I don't want, and that will eventually land me at the car. Okay. So in looking at this one, I can see this going a couple ways. Most obvious to me, this seems like this is not fallacious. Right? He wants a new car. Dad tells him that he's going to get the car if he gets an A. This person is reasonable enough to think about what that requires, getting a B, and that to get a B, they're going to have to study. They better skip the party as a result. All right. So I would say does not, and as such does not commit the slippery slope fallacy, although it looks like it could go on that way. The only way I can see somebody arguing that this is actually the slippery slope fallacy is this business here about being impossible for them to get the B on the final exam tomorrow if they go. It would probably be more reasonable to say it's very unlikely. So maybe that's the case, but again, this doesn't look like it's that bad. This looks more likely. Let's go to this last one. With the government giving multi-billion-dollar loans to the auto industry and spending hundreds of billions to bail out financial firms, we are well on our way to nationalizing all of the nation's industries. It won't be long before we are a socialist economy that completely forsakes free market deals. Yeah, that one does. And this is clearly the slippery slope fallacy, where you say they're allowing something here, giving these multi-billion-dollar loans, and it won't be long before we are a socialist economy that completely forsakes the free market. So they're saying this is just a slope to eventually becoming socialist, and not realizing you could give the loans here and not have to go all the way to socialism. They did it in order to bail out these financial firms, so that we didn't go under completely and wreck the economy as a whole, but you could still not go to free market everywhere. You could only do it, or you could, you could not go to, that doesn't mean you have to go to socialist economy everywhere. It might just be in a couple cases. And then lastly, we're going to get weak analogy. So throughout their history, through their service in wars as well as their recreational use, Jeeps have always proven to be very rugged vehicles. So Best Jeep is probably also quite rugged. That's a strong case that does not commit a fallacy. That's likely to be the case, because historically they've been this way. It's likely that they're still this way. That's fine reasoning. The public library has instilled filters on its computers that block access to pornographic websites. Scandalous. But the purpose of libraries is to distribute information, not to censor it. Before long, they'll be burning books just like fascist regimes in the 20th century. That's the slippery slope. Or excuse me, does, but it's slippery slope. This is the one earlier I said this is more likely a weak analogy case. The pilot who safely landed a commercial airliner, he got invited to the White House, but there's this other group of people who land on the water all the time that didn't get invited. What's up with that? That's fallacious, and that's because and it does commit this fallacy because there's strong disanalogies between what that pilot who landed a commercial plane with all those people on the river did compared to the people who are landing planes that are meant to land on the water do pretty regularly. And as such, not a strong analogy. Okay, so hopefully you find this helpful. That gives you my sort of strategy and technique for going through these and gives you some idea about what to expect. And so with that, good luck with the assignment.